5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition, liftoff, Semper Fi, aim high.
Well, Twitter recently deleted hundreds of accounts for the crime of, wait for it, undermining faith in NATO. Yes, I'll say it again. Undermining faith in NATO. That was the crime of hundreds of accounts on Twitter. Now, they've been deleted for some reason. The problem with the accounts, they were linked to Russia, Iran, and Armenia, and they undermined faith in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This should be laughable, except for when you consider what it actually means for a company that claims to be a social media company. And it's not just one. I'm Ben Swann, and this is Truth in Media. Well, welcome to the show. I'm going to break down for you today this story about Twitter deleting accounts that they say undermine faith in NATO in just a minute. But before we do, a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, ISE.media. Guys, we are only a few weeks away from the launch of our new digital platform. ISE.media will be a home for content creators who are being purged from social media sites like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. But it will be more than that. It will also contain a social media component that will allow you to post comments and be able to share information the same way you would on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Go to ISE.media right now and sign up to be a part of this new site when it launches. All right, so back to this story, because social media giant Twitter deleted 373 accounts. That's how many, claiming they were linked to Russia, Iran, and Armenia. Twitter said 100 accounts with Russian ties were removed for, quote, amplifying narratives that undermine faith in NATO and targeted the United States and the European Union. Twitter also said that 35 accounts with ties to Armenia were taken down, adding that they had been created to target Azerbaijan. The 373 associated accounts across the 4 networks were permanently suspended from Twitter for violations of our platform manipulation policies, the company said in a blog post. Now, some of you might actually be asking a very legitimate question. So what exactly is NATO, and why does it need to be protected by Twitter? Well, NATO was founded in the wake of the Second World War as a supposedly defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. However, with that nation's dissolution in 1991, NATO was not scrapped. In fact, it was expanded, both in member nations and its remit. NATO began to declare that its purview spread across the entire world and into cyberspace. At the organization's 70th anniversary in 2019, its former Supreme Commander, Admiral James Stavridis, said that it would be henceforth, quote, far more engaged in cybersecurity and would employ a far greater offensive cyber capability. Twitter's latest actions suggest that its proclamations were accurate. So Twitter's latest actions, again, go back to this idea that you are not allowed on their site to, quote, undermine faith in NATO. And if you are from the wrong group or the wrong political view or the wrong military view, you can't post here. What's really interesting about this, though, is that Twitter, or the company associated with Twitter that's been doing the research on their behalf and kind of flagging these groups, never bothered to actually prove a link between the government of Russia, Kremlin, or the government of Iran, or the government of Armenia for these posts. In fact, they just kind of loosely said these posts are linked and therefore we're taking them down permanently, removing them from the platform. But they didn't really prove any connection, which is fairly interesting when you consider the fact that Twitter itself has a history of allowing people who are connected to the US government and to NATO itself to be a part of their platform and part of the removal process. That includes, by the way, people associated with NATO's Atlantic Council. Indeed, the supposedly independent investigation and analysis team at the Stanford Internet Observatory, to which Twitter contracted out its work, itself has troubling connections to the U.S. state. For example, its non-resident fellow, Matt Masterson, was until recently a senior official at the Department of Homeland Security. Indeed, the whole observatory is located within the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, headed by former American ambassador to Russia and noted Kremlin hawk Michael McFaul. Supposed experts accuse users of being Russia-linked disinformation agents with great regularity. Ben Nimmo, data journalist and former NATO press officer, falsely asserted that a noted Ukrainian concert pianist and a Welsh pensioner were Kremlin bots. Nimmo was recently announced as Facebook's chief of intelligence. Now, I've told you for years about the long list of problems with social media companies and their connections to the US military and also to groups like NATO. In fact, if you think about Facebook, for instance, Facebook has an agreement and a partnership with the Atlantic Council, which is an offshoot of NATO. The Atlantic Council actually decides what news content appears in your Facebook feed. So think about this for a minute. NATO is actually determining what you get to see as news on Facebook. And they do so under the guise of being fact checkers and looking for information that is valuable and important for you as a reader and a user, without disclosing that they're actually a military operation. Unfortunately, the extent of the collaboration between big tech and the national security state extends beyond mere collaboration on whom to delete. In 2019, it was revealed that a senior Twitter executive was in fact a high-ranking officer in the British Army's 77th Brigade, its division devoted to psychological operations and online warfare. How he could have achieved such a high position at Twitter without the knowing cooperation of the tech giant is unclear. Even less certain is why this story was almost completely ignored in the mainstream media and how he maintains his job at Twitter to this day. So what you need to know here, and it's very troubling to say this, but the reality is social media companies like Twitter and Facebook are actually disinformation agents in and of themselves, working on behalf of organizations like NATO, working on behalf of the US government in order to control what we as users see, hear, and believe. That is their ultimate goal. The idea that the only worldview you are allowed to see or discuss is one approved by a government or even by a military, well, that's reason enough to walk away from those social media companies today.
Merci d'avoir regardé la vidéo. Si vous l'avez aimé, mettez un pouce. Et si vous voulez faire partie de la famille cosmique, abonnez-vous. Si vous désirez nous soutenir pour notre travail, vous pouvez trouver le lien Tipeee en description. Merci, à bientôt. Bisous.